Attachment and Separateness in the Experience of Symbiotic Relatedness by Rachel Blass and Sydney Blatt. Part 3. Experience of Symbiosis and the Developmental Process. Identity and Symbiosis. Core. Traditional view equals separateness equals identity. Blass and Blatt. Optimal symbiotic experiences themselves are also foundational for identity. Based to a large extent on Mahler's work, psychoanalysis has traditionally posited that identity emerges from symbiosis and can be achieved only when the individual differentiates and sets himself or herself apart from the mother-child dual unity. This approach to development equates separateness and differentiation. The attainment of separateness is considered tantamount to the consolidation of boundaries of self and object representations. Symbiosis as context for identity. Core. Symbiosis isn't just a phase to grow out of, but a permanent condition that underlies identity. However, optimal experiences of undifferentiation not only facilitate a consequent emergence of identity but, in and of themselves, provide an essential context for the development and maintenance of self-identity throughout the life cycle. Lichtenstein posits that it is the early mother-child unit and not its breaking up that constitutes the primary condition for identity in man. Thus, the very extremeness of the symbiotic relation becomes the very source of the emergence of human identity. Even as an adult, man cannot ever experience his identity except within the variations of a symbiotically structured Umwelt. Lichtenstein, 1977, pages 72 to 73. Little, 1981a, pages 123 to 125, posits a similar relationship between symbiosis and identity. I am postulating that a universal idea exists as normal and essential as the Oedipus complex, an idea of absolute identity with mother upon which survival depends. The presence of this idea is the foundation of mental health, development of a whole person, and the capacity for holistic thinking. It is the sine qua non for living continuously in one's body, for having an identity, and for being identical with and able to make assertion or statement of oneself. Kohut's 1980 notion of the existence of the self within a matrix of self-objects from birth to death, page 478, also contains the basic idea of identity being maintained within the symbiotic context. As Grotstein, 1982, page 65, explains, one of the most significant ramifications of Kohut's unique conceptualization of the self-object phenomena is the subtle inference one gets that the boundaries of the infant's mind transcend the confines of her body, and include the body of its mother. A further inference is that this subject-object redefinition of individuality transcends oneness per se and encompasses two-ness, as well as oneness for normal adults as well. Early coexistence of fusion and merger. Core. In infancy, fusion, separateness aim, and merger, attachment aim, are intertwined, both necessary for survival and relatedness. In the early phase of development, corresponding to Mahler's stage of symbiosis, experiences of fusion and merger coexist, Blass and Blatt, 1992. That is, the unitary psychic state of undifferentiation is experienced in two primary forms corresponding to the two lines of development, separateness and attachment. The infant nursing and falling asleep at the mother's breast experiences both A. Omnipotent fusion, the experience of being, owning, or creating the breast, and B. The oneness or dual unity of merger, the experience of being intimately bounded to the mother, C. Pine, 1985. Within an individual, both survival and the ability to find objects with which relationships can be formed depend upon the existence of a unity, which comes from the entity mother-infant. Little, 1981a, page 125. Internalization and integration. Core. Both fusion and merger become internalized as enduring structures in the self. Two approaches to representations. Distinct self/object representations. Hartmann, Jacobson, Kernberg. Internalized forms of relationship. Lowald, Grotstein, Schaefer. Authors adopt number 2 undifferentiated relationships are carried forward alongside differentiated ones. Elsewhere we have discussed how the internalization and integration of relationships along the developmental lines of both attachment and separateness are essential to the formation of an integrated sense of self-identity. Blatt and Blass, 1990. We have noted that the relationships that are normatively internalized in the course of development involve varying degrees of self-object differentiation throughout the life cycle. Blass and Blatt 1992.6. With the internalization of the relationship with the mother, the experiential quality of that relationship is internalized as well. Blatt and Barons 1987. Blatt and Blass 1990. 1996. Experiences of merger and fusion, therefore, both lie at the foundation of the individual's internal world. These very early experiences of undifferentiation remain as basic ingredients of the individual's sense of self, affecting the kinds of relationships the individual will actualize in an attempt to maintain a sense of self-cohesion. While the issue of the internalization and internal representation of relationships prior to the formation of distinct concepts of self and object is in need of further study, two main approaches are implicit in the literature. In one approach, representations exist only of distinct objects, whether part or whole objects. Accordingly, self-object undifferentiation is represented as absent or dissolving boundaries between distinct representations of self and object. Hartmann, 1964. Jacobson, 1964. Kernberg, 1976. The other approach emphasizes that what is internalized are forms of relationship. Lowald, 1980. And assumes that the undifferentiated relationship may be represented as such. Grotstein, 1984b. Schaefer, 1968. Page 224. Our position is in line with the latter approach. Thus, representations of the symbiotic relationship continue throughout life alongside representations of the distinct relationship between self and object, both kinds contributing to the comprehensive sense of self-identity. Dialectic of fusion and merger across life. Core. A healthy identity requires integration of both aims. Fusion omnipotence, potency, affectance. Merger intimacy, basic sense of oneness in close relationships. The nature of the dialectical process between optimal experience of undifferentiation on the attachment line, merger, and optimal experiences of undifferentiation on the separateness line, fusion, will also have an important impact on the development of the sense of self. Within this context, what determines the different manifestations of symbiosis in the clinical and non-clinical context are the extent to which a well-consolidated representation of the self, as distinct from the object, has developed and the degree to which the early experiences of symbiosis have been well integrated with other components of self-identity. Recognition of these factors further clarifies how the conception of infantile symbiosis may be reconciled with recent data indicating the neonate's highly developed capacities and may enhance our understanding of the developmental process. When early experiences of undifferentiated relatedness are optimally internalized and then later integrated with internalizations of relational experiences with distinct objects, internal representation of the early self-object undifferentiated state remains as a latent component of the individual's overall sense of self-identity. As such, this component provides the basic sense of oneness underlying all close forms of relationship along the attachment line. Along the separateness line, it provides a healthy sense of omnipotence, i.e., a basic sense of belief in one's potency, affectance, and control in interaction with the environment. Schaefer and Blatt, 1990. Illusory but normative symbiotic states. Core. Intense symbiotic experiences, love, religion, are illusory but not delusional. They don't negate boundaries, just suspend them. Winnicott. Playing/illusion as central to development. Merger and fusion are thus inherent or embedded in a variety of interactions but do not interfere with individuals' realistic perceptions of themselves or of others. Experiences of undifferentiation can become more central, leading to an intense sense of either merger or fusion. This is most noted in love relationships and religious experiences. Allison, 1967. While self-reflection may enable this experience to become conscious, more often it remains a form of primary process. Schaefer, 1968. Retaining an illusory quality. The individual unconsciously believes and acts as if he or she were one with the object, and the illusory nature of the experience precludes a meaningful questioning of its reality. Winnicott, 1971. Clinical distinction. Normal versus pathological. Healthy. Symbiotic experience coexists with intact boundaries and identity. Pathological. When integration fails, symbiosis dominates, points to structural disturbance. These intense symbiotic experiences, while central to the individual, do not necessarily point to severe psychopathology. Basic to our formulations is the view that experiences of being without boundaries do not in themselves indicate an absence of inner structures of boundaries or a lack of capacities for discrimination, either permanent or momentary. Experience, conscious or unconscious, is not a direct reflection of the structural state of the individual. Symbiotic experience must thus be seen as one dimension within the broader structural context, which includes both distinct self and object representations and internalized experiences of undifferentiated relatedness, as well as the press of developmental aims. It is when there are disturbances on this structural level that intense symbiotic experience may be indicative of pathology. Experience of symbiosis and psychopathology. Deficient internalization in severe but non-psychotic disorders. Core idea. Borderline and narcissistic patients have some differentiation, but their identity is fragile and overly dependent on maintaining active symbiotic states. Without them, emptiness, non-existence. Undifferentiation as related to the normal developmental process may be contrasted with what emerges in some severe but non-psychotic pathological states. There are certain disorders, usually classified as borderline and narcissistic, in which the early experiences of undifferentiated relatedness have been deficiently internalized and fail to become an integrated component of the overall sense of self-identity. While a representation of the self as distinct has been formed and thus the capacity for self-object differentiation is attained, an adequate sense of self-identity in these disorders remains dependent on the continuous, predominant, and active experience of the undifferentiated self-object representation. In the absence of such experience, the individual will feel blank, empty, or worthless. There is a sense of non-existence alongside a sense of a distinct self containing that experience of nothingness. The distinction between experiences of symbiosis in terms of attachment, merger, and separateness, fusion, provides further understanding of a wide range of clinical phenomena. Borderline syndromes, attachment line deficiency, excessive craving for merger, relationships desperately sought for identity maintenance. Clinical picture equals frantic attachments, annihilation anxiety. When the deficiency is along the attachment line, the excessive involvement of the undifferentiated self-object representation entails a concomitant intensified desire for a merger experience which, due to its being unintegrated within the overall sense of self-identity, leads to a perpetual search for gratifying objects in the immediate environment. The individual indiscriminately seeks relatedness in order to maintain a sense of identity and to avoid the sense of annihilation felt when alone. Blatt, 1974. Blatt and Zohar, 1991. Blatt, et al., 1995. This is characteristic of the clinical picture of various borderline syndromes. Narcissistic disorders, separateness line deficiency, excessive reliance on fusion. Others treated as self-extensions for control and self-gratification. Confirms early separateness needs but denies relatedness. Note on Kohut. Blass and Blatt emphasized that it's not just lack of differentiation, it's a failure to internalize symbiotic fusion in a healthy way. Contrast with Kohut's theory of grandiose self and idealized object. In contrast, when the deficiency is along the line of separateness, the excessive involvement of the undifferentiated self-object representation entails a concomitant experience of fusion. Here, too, due to the lack of integration of the experience within the overall sense of self-identity, its intensification results in pathological manifestations. The individual avoids feelings of emptiness and worthlessness through experiences of omnipotent fusion. Objects are felt as extensions of the self, in its service and subject to its control. Relationships in the immediate environment are desperately sought solely to confirm these roles and to gratify early symbiotic separateness needs. No real recognition of the other takes place. It should be noted that we are suggesting that the clinical picture of narcissism described above is founded on a deficient internalization of symbiotic relatedness along the separateness line. It is not, as has been suggested primarily by Kohut and his followers, that in and of itself the lack of differentiation of the deficiently internalized relationship determines the nature of the disorder. 7 This point was discussed earlier, Blatt, 1983, in a differentiation of the two major forms of idealization that Kohut specifies, that of the self, the grandiose self, and that of the object, the idealized parental imago, according to the separateness, self-definition, and attachment developmental lines. We do not imply by this, as does Kohut, 1971, 1977, 1984, that we view narcissism primarily in terms of a developmental defect. The impediments to the internalization of the fused relationship, including conflicts resulting from intensified aggressive drives, are of equal significance to the emergence of this disorder. Pathological illusion versus normal illusion. Normal symbiosis equals illusory but sustaining. Pathological symbiosis equals demands actual gratification. Collapses illusion turns into delusion under stress. Symbiosis in these severe but non-psychotic forms of character disorders is illusory but is different from the normal illusory experience. In the pathological group, the intensified involvement with symbiosis results in an increased demandingness for the actual gratification of early needs for experiences of merger or fusion, and thus the symbiotic wish appears in a reality-oriented context. Inner feelings of oneness and healthy omnipotence that are part of symbiotic experiences in well-integrated individuals are translated by these less integrated individuals into pressing expectations that others will provide them with a sense of unity and omnipotence they cannot achieve on their own. Consequently, these illusions are repeatedly confronted with reality and thus lose the transitional quality characteristic of illusion, Winnicott 1953-1971, and are vulnerable to becoming delusions. In a particularly frustrating environment, the symbiotic fantasies may lead to a disregard of reality even when directly confronted. During regressive periods in particularly severe narcissistic and borderline disorders, psychotic experiences of omnipotence, unity, and alternately of worthlessness and emptiness will then prevail. Psychosis, structural failure. No consolidated self-object boundaries ever form. Results: annihilation experiences or delusional symbiosis. Fusion or merger may still appear, but determined by type of psychosis. In the psychoses, the experience of symbiosis is fundamentally distinct from what has been discussed thus far. The disturbance is not primarily or directly tied to the internalization of the undifferentiated self-object relationship, but rather centers on a disrupted development of the representation of a distinct relationship between self and object. For the psychotic individual, the internalization of early interactions does not result in the consolidation of a well-demarcated concept of self. There is a fundamental absence of a sense of self as separate, which may eventually emerge as an experience of annihilation or alternately as a delusional experience of symbiotic relatedness. The identification of the parameters of a distinct self-concept consolidation and b. The internalization and integration of symbiotic relatedness clarifies the differences between these kinds of experiences of identity disturbance in psychosis and in severe character disorders. It is important to note here that, as in the case of non-psychotic individuals, the psychotic may experience the symbiotic fantasy along the attachment or separateness lines, depending on the nature of the psychosis. Blatt and Schichman, 1983, Blatt and Wild, 1976. Symbiosis and the self-object relationship. Kohut's contribution. Kohut elevated the value of symbiotic relatedness across the lifespan. Stressed that we live in a matrix of self-objects from birth to death. Alongside the challenges to symbiosis, there has been a renewed interest in that form of relatedness as a result of Kohut's 1971, 1977, 1984 comprehensive study of the self-object relationship. The self-object relationship is a symbiotic relationship, Ghetto, 1981, page 248, characterized by the lack of differentiation or only partial differentiation of self from object, Ornstein, 1978, page 62. A major contribution of Kohut's work is his emphasis on the value of the symbiotic forms of relatedness throughout life. He recognized and stressed that we live in a matrix of self-objects from birth to death, Kohut, 1980, page 478, and that people maintain lasting self-object relationships throughout life as part and parcel of normal growth and development, Goldberg, 1983, page 298. Kohut's limitation: fusion only. Self-object equals expansion of the self through projective identification. Does not recognize merger/attachment as its own dimension. It is important to recognize, however, that Kohut's self-object relationship refers to the symbiotic experience only along the separateness line. Kohut considered undifferentiation solely in terms of fusion, Blass and Blatt, 1992. Kohut considered undifferentiation solely in terms of fusion, Blass and Blatt, 1992. His concept of self-object relationship predicates that the boundary of the self, the I, transcends I's body to include the body of the other, and involves a process of projective identification from the separate self, Grotstein, 1984b, page 202. Reframing attachment as narcissism. Core, Kohut assimilated attachment-driven merger into narcissistic fusion, blurring distinctions. Concepts of union and merger of attachment fall outside the realm of the self-object relationship. Talpin, 1979, page 223. Merger-like experiences of boundary loss, what Greenacre, 1957, referred to as a love affair with the world, page 67, are, for example, reframed by Kohut as narcissistic experiences of an expanded self which includes the world, Kohut, 1966, page 261. As we have discussed elsewhere, Blass and Blatt, 1992, this led to considerable theoretical confusion. Clinical consequences of this narrow view. Risks misinterpreting patients' symbiotic wishes. Analysts must ask, is this about separateness, control/omnipotence, or attachment, intimacy/oneness? Technique depends on which aim is at play. Kohut's consideration of symbiosis solely in terms of fusion also has a limiting effect on the nature of interpretation within the clinical context. Awareness of the different experiential dimensions underlying the symbiotic fantasy requires an attunement to the individual's use of the symbiotic relationship for the gratification of needs for separateness as well as for attachment. Mahler's implicit recognition of attachment. Core, even Mahler, who stressed individuation, showed in practice that attachment-driven merger was present and clinically meaningful. It should be noted that although Mahler seemed primarily concerned with development towards separateness, which was at the foundation of her position that symbiosis must be abandoned in the course of development, her clinical examples contain poignant illustrations of the basic need for attachment that the individual seeks to gratify through symbiotic relatedness, e.g. Mahler, 1968. Implicit in those illustrations is the search for oneness with the maternal object that cannot ultimately be reduced to only the separateness need for omnipotence and control. Blass and Blatt's integrative aim. Core. Their project is to bring fusion, separateness, and merger, attachment, together in one coherent framework for both development and clinical work. In our examination of symbiosis in this paper, we have attempted to bridge the gap between Mahler's intuitive appreciation of both attachment and separateness experiential components of symbiosis and the theoretical conceptualization of the individual's symbiotic needs throughout the life cycle.